Hello everybody and welcome to today's lecture, which is biological determinism versus social construction of gender. Now if we look at these two terminologies, biological determinism and social construction, they might sound very complex. But to put things into more simpler terms, basically, what we are speaking about when we talk about biological determinism is nature. And when we talk about social construction, we are talking about nurture. Now, nature deals with genetic traits, whereas nurture deals with environmental influence. So in other words, nature versus nurture. So to begin, we are first going to unpack what is gender. Now, gender is often misunderstood and is used interchangeably with the word sex, and people often confuse gender and sex as the same term. And often we associate gender with boy, girl, man, and woman. And this is as a result of socialization, because this is how we have come to understand gender. But in actual fact, gender is actually an oversimplification of a very complex term that plays a major role in our identity. Now, if we look at the views related to sex as opposed to gender, now sex makes the distinction between two physically and genetically different categories, which is man and woman. In other words, with views that have come up in the past, we've only differentiated between two different types of sexes, which is man and woman. And basically what this entails is that men and women are biologically and physiologically wired differently. Now, these views do not account for contemporary or modern views. And if you look at the wide spectrum of gender identities that exist today, which is your transgender, bisexual, asexual, cisgender, these views do not cater for these wide spectrum identities. And as a result, alternate views have emerged. And these views basically entail the fact that women and men do not necessarily have to conform to a norm, like women do not necessarily need to be feminine, or men do not necessarily have to be masculine. Now, gender has a wide spectrum of terminologies, and so does sex. So for your own reference, I would advise you to go through the terminologies that I have uploaded on ECI to get a sense of the wide spectrum of terminologies that are used to describe sex and gender. Now, just to put things into perspective and differentiate between sex and gender, and basically to distinguish why these are not the same. Sex deals with more anatomical differences, biological categorizations, like for example, male and female, and there are distinct chromosomal differences like XX and XY. So this deals with more biological and genetic related traits, whereas gender is more a social marker that comes about as a result of environmental influences. It is socially constructed, and as a result of society, we have certain naming and dress preferences which have all been constructed through teaching, learning, and emulation. Now, if we look at the social construction of gender, now gender has been created and recreated from interaction and social life. And it's something that we do. It's an active identity and something that is imposed on us. Now, if you think about a baby before it is born, there is a lot of discussion about whether the baby is going to be a boy or a girl. Now, this identification is based on the child's biological sex, and this is the beginning of how a child becomes gendered. Now, I want you to think for a moment about modern trends and how, with today's society, we have things like gender reveal parties, and which is actually not all about gender, but what it does is it reveals the sex of an unborn child. And what I'm trying to say here is that it's impossible to tell the gender of a child because gender is something that's socially constructed. So these gender reveal parties shouldn't even be called gender reveal parties because you are basically unveiling the sex of a child. It's impossible to actually gender a child before it is born, as this is something that is learned through a pattern of behaviors. Now, the one thing we need to remember is by imposing gender identity on an unborn child, we maintain gender hierarchies. And traditionally, gender was only understood and recognized in two categories. But with modern views, that is obviously changing. So we also need to remember that many social structures and institutions today support just the two categories of gender. And an example of that would be sports are gendered, subjects are gendered, and even career types are gendered. Now, the one thing we need to remember is that previously there were only two categories of gender. And if we look at the section in between, which is your sex and intersex, as contemporary views emerged, you will find that these terminologies uh, obviously expanded and the categories um, basically increased, and today we have many different diverse categories of gender. So the one thing we need to remember is that gender does not just form two categories. There are a variety of categories. It is a complex term. It is diverse and multifaceted. And as teachers, we need to be aware of the diversity in terms of gender, as this could exist in our classrooms. Thank you for watching this lecture and have a great day and all the best.